When the inflationary crisis started in 2021, it took going back a ways in history to find a comparison. The Great Inflation of the 1970s, to be specific. This period was marked by many different economic factors, but if there's one thing people remember from that, it was the gas crisis. The 70s, in many ways, directly shaped the oil and gas industry we know today, and the changes of the era not only affected that behemoth of the energy sector, but nearly every other form of energy we know. Today, we're talking about the 1970s, the oil industry, and the surprising history that led not only to the modern fossil fuel industry, but the green technologies we're increasingly turning to in the present. I'm Weston Twardowski, an instructor and an associate director of Rice University's Center for Environmental Studies and the associate director of Eco Studio in Rice's Sustainability Institute, and you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Today we're sitting down with a team of historians, Dr. Cyrus Mody, Dr. Simone Schleper, and Dr. Odinn Melsted from Maastricht University in the Netherlands, who think not only about the complex history of the oil and gas industry, but the surprising technologies the industry has given birth to over the years. Odinn, Simone, Cyrus, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Weston.
So just to introduce yourselves to our audience and our listeners, can you quickly tell, who you are, where you're coming in from, and, the briefest of your general interests are?
Yeah, sure. I'm an historian of science and technology originally, although my PhD is in another field, science and technology studies. I have been teaching at the Maastricht University since 2015, but before that I spent 8 years at Rice University. For most of my career I've been looking at fields related to the microelectronics industries, fields like materials science, electrical engineering, semiconductor physics. But in the past few years I've turned toward issues related to energy and environment.
Terrific, thanks. Simone?
Sure, yeah. I'm an assistant professor also at Maastricht University. I have a background in the history of science. Now I do mostly environmental history. In the past, I've worked on the history of environmental governance in the second half of the 20th century, and the history of nature conservation in international organizations. That's what my PhD was about, and my first book is about that too. Since then, I've worked more on animal history and intersections between the history of technology and animals. A little bit of on oil history in that context as well. And I currently have a project called Intimate Allies that looks at couples working together in international governance, and particularly also at the role of women in this context.
It's funny, one of my favorite books from grad school is a book called Intimate Enemies, and I'm looking forward now to reading Intimate Allies down the road. Odinn, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Odinn Melsted. I have a background as a trained historian, did my BA in history, and then ventured more and more into history of energy, and ended up with writing a dissertation about historical energy transitions in Iceland, where I'm also from. And I've mainly gone into history of energy, technology, and environment, as I've seen that those three spheres are always connected. And that's also something that I approach in my work on the oil industry at Maastricht University. I've been there as a postdoc for a few years now and recently started as assistant professor. So that's my official job title right now.
Terrific, thanks. So we have three excellent, historians with us today, all thinking about energy, oil, environment, and questions historically. And so I'm really excited to talk to you both about your collaborative work and also how that shoots off into some of your personal projects. But I think what really brings you together is, is this moment of the 1970s and the kind of radical transformation that starts to happen across the oil industry in the 70s. And so just as an entryway to our listeners, a little bit glib here, but like, why should we care? What's going on in the 70s? What's happening that makes this worth our attention? So can you just start us off and tell us a little what's leading up to the 70s that makes it this pivotal moment in oil history?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a really big question about what happens in the 1970s, but I think one of the key parts is that, I mean, we know that the oil price goes up and down, but what really happened in the 1970s is that for several years, we actually had reductions in oil demand, and less oil was used in the 1970s. So we really have quite a few transformations. And when we look at the wider societal spectrum, not just about what the oil price is and what is used of oil, we can see that there's sometimes very drastic, very apocalyptic expectations of the future. People were afraid that we would run out of resources. People were afraid that there would be overpopulation. So we have a lot of those different debates and expectations and also fears that come together when we look at the 1970s through the lens of energy. And this is a period where everyone knows something about. Everyone knows the oil shock of 1973, even though historians have recently pointed out that this famous embargo was not that important. And there's a lot of myth making about that famous embargo in 1973. So there's a lot still to be discovered in that history once you dig into what actually happened and what the crisis actually was.
I will say I think most of our listeners probably, if they think of anything from the 70s, it is the embargo. So I'm interested to hear more about how we're framing that as not as important as we have thought it was. Cyrus, can you just give us a little background into, I think that was great, Odinn, on just pointing out like the amount of oil that's in demand changes, and certainly nodding to those concerns around actual, hey, we may not have infinite resources. What's going up that's leading up to this moment, though? Because my understanding is, especially post-war, oil demand just keeps rising and rising and rising. And so there must be some kind of shock with it that starts to happen, either in the 60s or the 70s that causes this break of some kind, right?
Yeah, so there's a number of shifts that sort of intersect around 1970 in terms of the diplomacy and the technology, the geophysics of oil. There's also shifts that come in terms of wider intellectual currents, particularly around the environmental movement. I'll let Simone talk about those a bit. But you can see the 70s is kind of bracketed by two tipping points, at the beginning and the end of that decade. At the beginning of that decade, you have a moment when countries in the global south that are oil producers, but that at that point don't have a lot of control over the oil that gets produced in their countries. They start, those countries have been making demands for greater participation in the oil industry and a greater cut of oil revenues basically throughout the 20th century. But until the late 1960s, those demands generally weren't very successful. And the reason they weren't very successful is that the oil firms that were producing oil in those countries could simply increase production elsewhere and make up for any cut in production by countries like Mexico, Iran, Venezuela, etc. So what intersects with that longer story in 1970 is that there's a peak in U.S. domestic oil production. Ultimately, it turns out not to be a permanent peak because in the 2000s, again, U.S. production goes up again. But at least in the 1970s, people thought this was probably going to be a permanent peak in production, and that therefore Western companies really didn't have a way to respond to demands initially from Libya and Iran in 1969, 1970, and then all across OPEC, basically for the rest of that decade. So that leads to a gradual rise in the price of oil and to, big worries about the scarcity of oil. I mean, people in the oil industry generally are pretty clear that there's no that the world isn't running out of oil, but that the world might be running out of cheap Middle Eastern oil. And that leads to, a big scramble for alternatives, so alternative fossil fuels, alternative energy more generally, also to conservation. So, this decrease in demand that Odinn is talking about. So that's how the 70s start. And then the 70s end, initially with the second oil crisis of 79-80, and which seems to confirm that, high oil prices are here forever. Scarcity is something that people need to adjust to. Alternatives need to get rolled out quickly. But then, starting around 1980, the price of oil starts to go down slowly, and then in mid-decade, very rapidly, and that wipes out this bubble of oil prices that had been rising ever since the early 1970s, and totally reorients the industry. Suddenly, people are having to deal with the problem of abundance rather than the problem of scarcity.
I mean, that's fascinating. Yeah, I think that's, especially from Houston, people hear the 80s and they're thinking very much about the oil bust here and those very real felt consequences. But I think that, part of what you're also getting at, and I want to go to Simone in a second and hit on exactly that, the kind of rising environmental factor you were talking about as well. But I mean, I think the cultural change component that gets hit on, and we're definitely going to talk more about those renewable sources that people go to. But in the way that we start to navigate the 70s around oil costs too much, or oil might be going away, and so we see cars shrinking and we see efforts to make cars more energy efficient, and so some of those kind of reduction methods, that there was a psychological kind of cultural response to the fact that these prices are going up, to the fact that even if oil globally is not going away, that something's changing around it. And the way that those companies respond has all of these kind of ramifications into people's daily lives in the 70s in really fascinating ways. Simone, can you walk us through a little bit? Yeah, where does the environmentalism factor come in here? I mean, certainly throughout the 60s, earlier, and certainly earlier for thinking about conservation. Obviously, there's a longer history of environmentalism, but that kind of modern environmentalism moment of the mid-century, if you can walk us through that a little bit, and then into some of your own research, specifically around the 72 kind of global convention around environmentalism.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I could probably talk about this forever, but I'll I think for the US context, obviously everyone knows Rachel Carson and the publication of Silent Spring from 62. I think that's a really important moment of the public awakening of environmental thought in the United States, right?
And this is her book, Silent Spring, and some of that activism around pollution.
Pollution, particularly DDT and pesticides, right? And how that's threatening wildlife. But also potentially human health. So that is, for the US context, quite important. Obviously, that her book was also picked up in other regions, especially in Latin America, and South America, and other parts of the world as well. But it's several things coming together at that moment. So we had a bigger public awareness of environmental issues that are related to industry in that sense. But you also had international organizations starting to realize that they also needed to do something about the environment. So there is also this sort of official reaction to a growing public concern that has to do with environmental issues, with oil spills in Europe, with air pollution in Europe, etc. So you have already in 68, you have a big UNESCO conference that really termed this idea or concept of the biosphere that needed protection. And then in 72, and that's the conference that you're referring to, we have the first United Nations conference that deals with environmental topics. the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment. And that is really where you see environmental mechanisms that we still have nowadays forming and being put in place. So if you look at it from an environmental history perspective or governance perspective, that is also where the 70s are really important, because that's the moment when we get things like, or we get decisions on where within the United Nations system environmental decisions are being made. And in 72, they decide on founding an environmental program, UNEP, the United Nations Environmental Program, which is sort of, it's a small bureau. It's placed in Kenya, so in the global south. This also has symbolic value, obviously. And it's more of a coordination body. So it's not, it's really there to coordinate stuff that's already happening within the United Nations. So that's also quite important, because it means that we don't get a specialized agency per se within the United Nations, but you get a bureau that's more there to coordinate things, as the idea was the environment is actually part of all the other things that are already happening, and it just needs to be coordinated better. That also comes with a smaller budget than some of the other agencies, etc. But yeah, so that's important for how the UN eventually deals with environmental stuff. And what's also important is that this coincides with discussions about how international development should work, and that also feeds into some of the work that Odinn, Cyrus, and I are doing currently on philanthropy and all philanthropy and discussions about development. Obviously, the role of the global South is being discussed at Stockholm as well. The famous idea of the polluter pays basically also comes in at that point. And poverty is pollution by Indira Gandhi. It's also a very famous slogan that was sort of really important in making decisions about how environmental policies put in place. And what we see there already is that discussions about scarcity that also have to do with worries about resource shortages, with the Club of Rome report, Limits to Growth, which we haven't mentioned yet, which also plays a huge role around the same time as this conference, all feed into discussions about, what kind of development can we have if we take environmental protection seriously? Can there be growth? What kind of growth can we have? And what you see happening is that environmental politics actually becomes very closely linked to developmental programs in the global South. So that is also why the SDGs are, the environmental stuff that's happening within in organizations such as the UN are built into development goals. That is sort of the moment when this is, I don't want to say decided, but it's sort of a path that is being paved at that moment.
No, that's fascinating. And I'm curious if you can talk a little bit. I mean, certainly it seems like a lot of, early kind of environmental policy is being decided here. I'm sure how that interacts with the oil industry in particular, since we are coming back to kind of energy production in this moment, how they're making decisions on things. But I want to hone in actually a little bit on, some of those notions of focusing on development and focusing on, what does it mean for us to follow kind of environmental policy and actually identify, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but like in my understanding, the idea that you are an oil executive, a fossil fuel proponent, right, and not an environmentalist is not guaranteed at the same time in the 70s. Like the rising environmental movement is much more nascent, is much more open. It's a lot less concentrated on climate change, a lot more concentrated on pollution, on conservation. And so I think that's really interesting to think about. And if you can walk us through a little bit of some of those cultural and perhaps policy connective tissues when you aren't focusing on climate change yet, when you're focusing more on, okay, where does the oil exist and how are we going to be equitable in certain ways around pollution? I think that's a very different kind of conversation we're having in the 70s. And so, and it gives us a bit of an understanding of why 50 years down the road, the conflicts that we kind of feel in day-to-day life around what environmentalism is and who identifies as an environmentalist are just radically different than they were 50 years ago. See Simone and Cyrus both kind of nodding your heads.
This is a question that kind of cuts across all three of us, but
Yeah.
neither of us is sort of centrally attached to this question. So,
Well,
might be
Cyrus, you're
difficult.
talking, so take it.
Okay, well, yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpick there, and I'm not going to get to all of it. So Odinn and Simone should definitely jump in. But I mean, one place to start is that the kinds of environmental issues that are being confronted in the 60s and into the 1970s are issues that oil executives think they can deal with and think it's going to be good for their companies to deal with in a way that seems to be rather different to how they're thinking about climate change from the 1990s forward, right? So, for instance, what are the really spectacular events that drive forward the environmental movement in the late 60s and into the early 1970s? It's things like, giant smog episodes, rivers catching on fire from all the petrochemicals being dumped in them, and especially its oil spills, right? Well, oil spills aren't good for the oil industry, right? They're not good reputationally, but also just, instrumentally. That's a lot of oil they don't get to sell. So oil executives are very interested in preventing oil spills, in preventing the spills that do happen from, causing a lot of damage, in cleaning them up, in participating in international negotiations over, maritime pollution. That's one of the big topics that gets talked about at Stockholm and its sequels, for instance. Same with smog and with petrochemical pollution. The oil industry, well, maybe they're not eager to prevent smog or to prevent effluent streams, clean up effluent streams, but I think there's a recognition in the late 60s, early 70s that these are harming the reputation of their industry, and that there are concrete steps, feasible steps, that industry can take to monitor pollution, to emit less pollution, to clean up the pollution that they are emitting. So I think it's a little bit about what are the issues that are really hitting the public hard in this period, and what are the issues that the oil industry thinks actually they have the agency to do something about. And there's a convergence of those two in the late 60s, early 70s that starts to diverge, I think, in the 1980s and 90s.
I think something fascinating that's occurring to me as you're talking about that as well is, many of the things, and this is not a novel take, but I think many of the things that you're listing here, smog, rivers on fire, they're things that are also very inescapable for anybody, right? I'm thinking of LA specifically. Like, if you lived in LA in the 70s, like, smog was a condition of life, regardless of if you were the CEO of Shell or you were, anybody who's, waiting tables. Starbucks wasn't around yet, but whatever they may have been, right? And I think that, it's part of why that movement was so successful with clean water, clean air, in a way that climate change has felt much more amorphous to us for a long time, has felt like it's going to hit different people differently and is somehow, for some, escapable in ways. I think a lot of opinions are changing around that. I think people are experiencing ramifications now that's shifting how we understand and relate to it, that's driving that movement. But for a long time, I think some of the, the disparity there has been around, well, is it actually going to do anything to us, which is a narrow view of the world, but also has stymied some of that progress. I don't know if you agree with that, but as you were talking about some of these movements, that's starting to register.
Yeah. So I mostly agree with that. I think also it has a lot to do with visibility. Many years ago now, I sat on a dissertation committee in the Rice History Department of Merritt McKinney, wrote a thesis on air pollution in Birmingham, Alabama. And yeah, one of his arguments is that you get a lot of advances in environmental regulation in the 1970s when what's being regulated is things that people can see,
Mm.
right? You can see smog in a way that you can't see carbon dioxide. You can really see oil spills. And so those are the things that get tackled first.
Absolutely. Okay, so we have this moment. We have all these environmentalists who are starting to crop up. We have the scarcity problem. We have a changing kind of dynamic in the 70s. So the next big question for you is, how do these companies start responding? What do they start doing in response to this changing environment? And I think, you know, nodding towards this is where some of your really fascinating work on some of the alternatives they start pursuing and some of the kind of changes they start seeing starts getting explored. So I'd love to bring that in.
Yeah, definitely. I guess it's connected to what the expectations of the future are. And what we see oil companies doing, especially in the 1970s, is put a lot of efforts into planning departments, and not just to plan what the next investors are going to be, but to also anticipate what the future is going to be and what the options are. And sometimes they actually look at multiple futures. Scenario planning is a method that Shell, so the European Shell, pioneered, where you look at multiple possible futures for the oil market. And that is something that feeds into looking at the future of the energy spectrum as rather open. And together with, as we've talked about, anticipations that easy oil would run out and couldn't that easily be replaced anymore. So easy oil in the sense of conventional oil reservoirs, where you drill down, do a little bit, and then have highly profitable oil. We know that there's many unconventional oil resources, but the profitability is a question. So knowing those two factors, the uncertain future, but also that there might be an easy oil scarcity, they start investing more and more into alternatives. And in the projects managing scarcity and sustainability, we look at a range of alternative energy. So we look not so much at the fossil alternatives that has been done by others, and that is actually well known that the oil industry put a lot of efforts into the synthetic fuels, put a lot of efforts into coal and trying to make that profitable, looked into shale resources. But in the 1970s, we also see that oil companies start investing heavily into low carbon alternatives. So solar energy, so both photovoltaics and solar thermal, geothermal energy, also things like batteries and fuel cells. And then we really see that against maybe the conventional wisdom, if you look at what oil companies are doing today, they are investing the oil profits not to just pay to the shareholders a good sum, but to actually invest into research and development. And a good deal of those oil profits from the high oil prices in the 1970s ended up going into alternative energy development. And when we say they invested into solar, nuclear, geothermal, and other energy alternatives, this was not just small laboratory things. They actually bought up startups. They actually invested into major subsidiaries and quite visibly put a foot into the alternative energy scene, especially in the United States.
I think that's, yeah, please.
And for the state of alternative energy at the time, this was a big deal, right? So at least in certain alternative energy fields, oil companies were the dominant players, right? So Atlantic Richfield was the world's biggest producer of photovoltaic cells in the mid-1980s, I think.
These are solar panels.
Union Oil, correct me if I'm wrong, Odinn, had the world's largest operating geothermal field at one point. So, even if you don't say, well, these oil companies radically changed their business, they were still oil companies. These investments made a very big difference for these various alternative energy fields that at the time were quite small.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fascinated by that. That yeah, they could both not change their business and be trying to move into some kind of what seemed like future tech. I'm sure at the time. I mean, I think it's important, Odinn, that you're pointing out that this is not just a small individual lab somewhere. Certainly, people have been playing with solar energy much longer than the 1970s. I think you actually mentioned that some of the oil companies had actually looked at nuclear back as early as the 20s, which I found really surprising and would love to hear about. But that this is a major step up in advancement and really, an apportioning of kind of research dollars and funds that drives significant change for the first time. But yeah, I would love to hear a little bit about that foray into nuclear in the 20s, if anybody wants to detour for a moment.
I can probably handle that because the PhD in our project who's writing about that, Michiel Broen, has just finished his dissertation, so it's fresh in my mind. But the story there is that there's a lot of overlap between nuclear technology and the kind of geophysics of uranium and oil technology and the geophysics of oil. So oil and uranium are often found in the same places. So you can use some of the same techniques to find them both. And yeah, there are certain advanced scientific instruments that depend on nuclear phenomena that are useful in finding oil, which meant that oil companies were among the very first to incorporate the new quantum mechanics in the 1920s and 30s. That in turn meant that the oil industry knew more about nuclear instrumentation and knew more about the geophysical and geochemical properties of uranium than any other industry on the eve of World War II, which in turn meant that when the US and its allies were building up an atomic weapons program, and they needed to hire thousands of people and let lots of contracts to build facilities for, enriching uranium and constructing the bombs. Well, companies related to the oil industry in one way or another really dominated that. So, a huge number of the people who worked for the Manhattan Project were actually working for companies like Standard Oil of New Jersey, Exxon, DuPont, Tennessee Eastman, M.W. Kellogg, all companies that had some kind of foot in the oil industry. And that relationship with the nuclear world continued, although it also evolved after the war. So especially smaller companies that didn't have access to cheap Middle East oil, some of them turned to uranium mining and refining as an alternative market, particularly a company called Kerr-McGee. The big companies, Exxon, Shell, BP, they kind of sat on the sidelines, but they had small scale nuclear programs all through that period. And then in the late 1960s, when they could kind of see that the price of oil was going to go up and they needed to, sort of prepare defensively, then they really got into nuclear in a big way at all stages of the nuclear fuel cycle, from finding the uranium, mining it, refining it, constructing nuclear plants, dealing with the waste, and even with unconventional nuclear technology like fusion and fast breeder reactors. They mostly gave it up, or almost entirely gave it up in the 1980s for a variety of reasons. But yeah, at least in the 70s, there were a lot of worries actually that certainly the US and to some extent even the global uranium market was being cornered by oil companies.
That's yeah. I don't think most people are familiar with that particular risk. I want to go back to something you said at the beginning, actually talking about like some of the earlier reasons that uranium expertise, because actually Odinn, I think something that parallels really interestingly with that is geothermal and the technologies that come out of the oil industry, really making geothermal technology possible, really thinking about how we're utilizing this resource. And I know a lot of your work is focused on that. And so I'd love to hear some about the connections between the oil industry and the geothermal industry.
Yeah, definitely. Oil and geothermal are closely related, as you've said. And there's a lot of reasons for this relationship. So one is purely material. oil and gas resources, so hydrocarbon resources, and hydrothermal resources, so hot water and steam under the ground. They're both found in underground reservoirs, so porous rock. And you need to drill down. First of all, you need to find it, and then you need to drill down to somehow get it out and somehow extract it out of the earth. So materially, they are very similar, but also in the development history, there's a lot of connections. So geothermal energy for power production, so at a larger scale than just for a few spa baths, as it has been used for centuries, was mainly developed first in the early 1900s, usually at a very experimental scale, where people drilled down, tried to get some steam, and tried to run a turbine with that to produce electricity. And one of those experiments was actually in California at the geysers north of San Francisco. And this wasn't too successful in the beginning because there's a lot of challenges involved with dealing with hot steam and trying to drill down for that. And what happened there is that in the 1950s, there's a startup that uses new drilling technology and actually manages to drill for substantial steam and build the first power plant there and supply electricity to the major utility of the area, PG&E. And what's really interesting there is that in 1967, an oil company, so first it is Pure Oil, which a year later is bought up by Union Oil. So that's the big Californian oil company that enters geothermal energy. And what they do at the geysers, this area that had been developed north of San Francisco, is that they offer the startups to come in and take over all operations while keeping them at a third each as part of the consortium. So the two startups had 2/3 a share of the operations, but the oil company took all the capital risk and brought in their capital and their drilling and geophysical expertise. And what really happened there is that oil companies could apply their technologies that could be adapted to geothermal energy because, again, it's finding, drilling, and extracting fluids and gases out of the earth, which is very similar in theory, at least, between hydrocarbon and hydrothermal. So there we have an oil company that goes in, and in the 1970s, they actually expand this field at the geysers to become the largest geothermal power complex in the world. So there we have an oil company or its geothermal division actually pioneering an alternative energy. And there's many of those relationships elsewhere in California and also in Texas. It's mainly oil companies that have found geothermal resources on accident. But then there's also other instances like Iceland and New Zealand where there's no domestic oil industry. There, the geothermal industry has invited, kind of in a poll, the oil industry influences. So by learning about geoscientific exploration for those resources, by buying drilling equipment, which is kind of an external semi-related service industry between the oil industry and other industries, and also by adopting reservoir management principles. So getting oil and gas out of the ground over a prolonged period out of a reservoir is very similar to getting geothermal steam out of the ground and trying to use that resource most efficiently. So actually the geothermal industry, both in California and in Iceland, New Zealand, wherever, they started using very similar methods to what they do in the oil fields. So once the pressure decreases, which happens both in oil and gas fields and in geothermal fields, to pump something down. So in the oil industry, it's usually some sort of gas, so either methane or CO2 that's pumped into the reservoir to keep the oil flowing. But in the geothermal industry, it's then water, because the heat itself is only usable if it's in some sort of hydrothermal state. So you can only get out the steam or the water. And if there's no more water down there, you can't use that heat. So in a way, they're using the same principles as in the oil industry. And that's a few examples of this relationship that helps explain why oil companies actually entered the geothermal alternative. So there's a lot of conspiracy theories, maybe not entirely without reason, that oil was trying to control geothermal energy because in the mid-1970s, nearly every US oil company bought up geothermal leases especially in the U.S. American West. But that was also because they could apply their own technology in that alternative energy field. So that helps explain why oil companies are so present in the geothermal scene, especially in the 1970s, but also why there's so many references. If you go look at the technical literature and what geothermal engineers say, they always talk about oil. So that's the reason why there's such an interesting and close relationship between those two energy industries.
I mean, this is fascinating too, because in both with nuclear and with geothermal, I'm cherry picking, but both France in the 70s starts to build up its nuclear program and is now close to 80% of their energy comes from nuclear. Iceland, of course, had used geothermal earlier, but really starts to build it up again in response to this crisis in the 70s, and I believe is about 2/3 of their energy sources are now geothermal based. And so, I mean, we see models of other countries today that are really, driven by alternative fuel sources, that oil is not the end all and be all. And I think there's often a kind of a narrative of oil, fossil fuels. That's the easiest. That was the most direct. That was the obvious fuel source. And of course, different places have different resources. We are not all Iceland. We do not all have access to the kind of geothermal resources they have. But these do provide models, and this moment in the 70s of when there is this investment and this interest demonstrates actually there are alternative ways that our kind of energy production history could have been shaped, and there were different directions that these industries could have gone down. I don't know if you want to jump on that a little more and explore some of where we wind up going before we get to the 80s maybe, and some of that goes away.
Just following up on Iceland, you're correct that geothermal energy is a very important part of the energy spectrum there. So it's about 1/3 of the electricity and most of the heating energy. So 9 out of 10 houses are heated with geothermal hot water. And that is hot water that has largely been developed thanks to petroleum technologies. So that's just following up on that.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, and if I may, because you said we're not all Iceland, Texas actually has a lot of geothermal resources, but they have remained undeveloped. So I have looked specifically at geothermal energy. So this is something that maybe I find more present, but the oil industry has basically drilled into pretty much any formation in the Mexican Gulf, and a lot of those formations are very hot. And in some parts of the Mexican Gulf, there's actually geopressured hydrocarbon resources. So that's very high-pressured fields that have both hot steam and gas, methane. And there were very intensive experiments to try to get that resource out and use both the geothermal steam for power production, but also the methane for conventional energy production. And the oil industry and the Department of Energy were involved with that. And there was an experimental plant at Bayou, Texas, if I remember correctly, in 1989. But this remained at an experimental stage. And I've read from the geothermal side that there was not that much interest from the oil side to actually develop those resources. But it's not like geothermal energy wouldn't exist in Texas, for example. It's just that it hasn't been developed. And there's, of course, historical reasons behind that. And more recently, there's actually a firm that has grown and received a lot of attention in Texas, Fervo Energy, which is mainly oil guys going into geothermal energy and applying particularly horizontal drilling. So a drilling technique that's usually used for fracking, where you drill down, turn 90 degrees, and drill into different formations. And that has a lot of potential because, as I've mentioned, geothermal energy is usually not that useful if you don't have any water to kind of get to it. But if you can drill into almost any formation and pump water into there, you can use geothermal energy in many places where it hasn't been used just because the natural conditions weren't that ideal. So this is just to think about that Texas is actually a huge geothermal potential leader But if we look around it today, we don't see it yet.
Every oil and gas person in Texas is lighting up as you say that. We have a whole episode actually coming about geothermal in Texas because exactly it is. Yeah, there's several other startups that are also doing a lot of work there, and especially here in Houston, it's certainly something that as people think about, oh, if there's going to be a transition, if there's going to be a downturn, which in many ways I think, is a kind of interesting moment, not yet having hit the kind of 1970s moment, but I think we're starting to feel some of that, on the ground, especially in a place that calls itself the oil and gas, the fossil fuel, the energy capital of the world, right? I think there's a little something in the air of, is oil going to stay as prevalent as it currently is? Are we coming towards a peak? And if we are, then certainly want to be leaders in these fields. And yeah, I mean, in geothermal, as you're pointing out, has various and interesting applications. I'm sure you saw there was a apartment building in New York City that went in a couple of weeks ago that is now fully geothermal, which is not the place I would jump to as thinking of a geothermal capital. But yeah, the technology that's changed dramatically has allowed that. I want to go back to this 70s moment to actually really move us into the 80s and to point to what changes, because we've been talking about the 70s, we've been talking about the kind of moment of scarcity there and the way that this impacts these various investments into alternative fuel sources. What starts to change? Because we didn't wind up in the future of France or Iceland where we're just all running off of these sources. So what changes that where we don't find ourselves with these alternative fuel sources really dominating?
Yeah, maybe to go back to your question about kind of alternative pathways, but also maybe then to return it to Simone's work a little bit. I mean, one of the big points of our project is that there were alternative pathways available, even in the US, that all of these companies were investigating solar, investigating geothermal, investigating nuclear. If you look at oil CEOs, well, certainly big oil CEOs' speeches from around 1980, 1981, there's a surprising amount of consensus. They all say there's plenty of oil out there, but too much of it is in the hands of the Middle East. Therefore, in the short term, we need to, increase domestic production of oil. We need to increase domestic production of, more unconventional hydrocarbons that can be turned into something like oil. We need to, in the medium term, nuclear is going to be super important. But at some point, they're a little vague on what that point is, but they also kind of say in the first half of the 21st century, other alternatives, renewable alternatives, are going to be profitable, and we are going to be heavily invested in them, and they're going to be a big part of our business. So you see that all that discourse kind of all across the industry, but then you also see a few individual leaders in the oil industry, not just making kind of business decisions about alternative energy technologies, but also trying to put energy and resource scarcity and environmentalism on a global agenda through organizations like the United Nations, but also through other organizations that control, such as the Aspen Institute or the Club of Rome. In our project, we look in particular at two people, Robert O. Anderson, the founder of Atlantic Richfield, and Morris Strong, who was a Canadian diplomat, but before he was a diplomat and after he was a diplomat, he was deeply involved in the oil industry. And for that, we really heavily rely on Simone's earlier work on Strong's environmental diplomacy.
We were coming up on time, but do you want to briefly touch on that, Simone, and just give us a little insight into what was going on there?
Yeah, sure. So I think it also relates a lot to again, notions of scarcity and resources and sort of the bigger picture, right? So if you set aside current discussions about climate change, if you go back in time and you think about oil as a resource and non-renewables as a resource, and you think about other types of resources that might become scarce, that could also be natural environments as such, right? So this notion of population growth, which is an issue for energy resources, but it's also an issue for other types of resources, right? And has a lot to do with what, infringement on natural environments, etc. So these kind of discourses also came together in the 70s at these, for instance, the Stockholm Conference, at which Maurice Strong actually served as Secretary General of this conference, right? So this is really important. He was also first Secretary General of the United Nations Environmental Program. So you have an oil guy leading the United Nations Environmental Program, right? So, I mean, nowadays that sounds strange, but that also explains why, I mean, for that time, it's not necessarily strange. And it also explains why there are so many entanglements between oil money, because, you know, oil guys tend to have really, oil people tend to have really vast networks. And nature conservationists, on the other hand, are interested in, just like all people, in sort of big natural areas. So, you know, I think there's an interest there. They need, both of these groups need land, so there they can liaise in that sense. And they also need money, so they're also interested in taking oil or energy money. So there's a symbiosis basically at that moment of interest that kind of comes together in this really, for us now, weird network that involves environmentalists and energy and all people, but not so weird if you look at the sort of historical trajectories that leads to that. And I think that's also, in essence, an important threat to our projects. And it's similar to these entanglements with alternative energies, you know, because there are historical reasons for why they exist, in a nutshell.
No, that's great. Thank you. So maybe we'll just briefly touch on, what starts to change into the 80s that causes these factors not to become the dominant force.
Yeah, it's a bunch of different things. It's partly just the individuals involved. So some of the kind of older generation, people like Anderson, they retire out of active participation in these debates. One thing we track quite closely in our project is in the 40s, 50s, 60s, you get a generation of oil executives who are trained in the sciences and in engineering. And, you know, for them, it's very attractive for their companies to go into these really high-tech fields like nuclear and solar. But in the late 70s and into the 1980s, that generation, they retire out and they get replaced by people who have degrees in finance or in business administration, who are more attentive to the kind of profit margins, less attentive or less, you know, attracted to speculative high technology. You know, also the price of oil goes down as sort of OPEC loses some discipline, and you know, eventually the Saudis open the taps, and you know, the price of oil really plummets. You also, you know, get new oil fields opening up in the North Sea and Alaska and off the Gulf Coast. One thing that means is that as the price of oil declines, it becomes cheaper to buy some other company's oil reserves than to explore for new reserves of your own. So, you know, companies are suddenly on the lookout to buy each other up. This is sort of encouraged also by the emergence of a new generation of corporate raiders, people like T. Boone Pickens, Ivan Boesky, Michael Milken even, who, you know, some of them are more associated with oil, like Pickens, but all of them are in oil or making deals in oil. And those are putting a lot of pressure on companies to get out of investments for the long term and really focus on investments for the short term that are going to return money to their shareholders. So that means that they get out of a lot of things, including a lot of oil-related activities. But it definitely means that they get out a lot of these more speculative technologies that everyone agrees aren't going to be profitable until sometime in the 21st century. So they cut their solar programs. They really cut back on their nuclear programs, especially after 3 Mile Island. But it's not only because of the controversy, it's also you know, because of these financial difficulties. And the oil industry becomes much more of an oil industry.
This is fascinating to me, and unfortunately, the note we are going to have to end on. But I actually find this really hopeful that, I really thought the kind of what happened in the 80s was going to be a lot more, oh, we found tech that let us find new oil supplies, and there were some changing global forces, and what you're actually talking about, I mean, not solely, of course, these are things that impact it, but it's not just the price. It's actually very cultural. It's actually very who's behind these, where are we seeing the future of things going. It's much more individual action, that actually gives me hope that those are changeable things, and readily changeable things, that point to a world in which we can imagine real leadership from fossil fuel industries, and pointing us back in the direction of thinking more in long term, and less in those kind of short term returns that you're describing right now. So I actually find a really encouraging note to end on. Dr. Odinn Melsted, Dr. Cyrus Mody, and Dr. Simone Schleper, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a delightful conversation and very enlightening, and I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thanks to you
for having us. Yeah.
We'll now turn to our researcher, Naman, who can tell you all about how you can get involved in Houston this week.
Hi everyone! Whether you have free time this week to volunteer for the community or want to wind down with friends and family, there are many ways for you to get involved in various community events this week. If you are in the mood for a fun family event for all ages, make sure to put BatFest on your calendar for this Saturday, September 28th from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. Taking place at the Houston Arboretum and Nature Center, BatFest is a celebration of local bat species and a great place to learn about the current conservation efforts being made to help mitigate the decline of our local bat populations. This is a great activity for the family, as this free, no registration required event will host a myriad of fun bat-themed activities and crafts, including story times, games, food trucks, and more. If you are more interested in volunteering this week, however, don't worry. You can also volunteer for the Woods Project this Wednesday, September 25th from 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. The Woods Project provides accessible wilderness exploration experiences, promoting academic success and career readiness in high school students who would otherwise not have access to such opportunities. To support this amazing local initiative, you can help prepare and clean the sleeping bags used over the summer, helping to transport the bags and wash them in the laundromat. It is a super easy way to get involved, and you can sign up at thewoodsproject.org, making sure to complete the event volunteer form beforehand. Alternatively, you can also participate in Adopt a Beach this Saturday from 8:30 a.m. to 12 p.m. The Texas Adopt a Beach program is a volunteer-based beach cleanup program, and you can help out this Saturday by registering to clean a beach near you. At the beach cleanup, Adopt a Beach will provide all necessary cleanup supplies, but you may want to bring work gloves and a reusable water bottle to keep yourself hydrated. Register today at texasadoptabeach.org. Hopefully, you will find one of these activities a fun and fulfilling way to spend your free time this week. If not, that's okay, as there will always be more ways to get involved in next week's episode. Stay tuned.
Up next week, we'll be talking about what walkability around Houston looks like and why it matters for a better environment. A quick reminder that if you have questions or ideas for what you'd like featured on Gulf Streams, you can leave a voicemail at 713-348-4081 or email us at westonT@rice.edu. And you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies, with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski, co-produced by Joseph Campana, audio engineer Rico Enriquez. Research support provided by Sophia Soltes, Jaden Bray-Boyce, and Neman Rinsdorf. Stay tuned for the R&R Show with Ronnie Renfro and Tom Richards here on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.